I'm Jason King, Beirne Chair and Director for the Center for Catholic Studies at St. Mary's University. I'm here today talking with Dr. Tim Gabrielli. He is the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Intellectual Tradition and Associate Professor in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Dayton. He's the author of Confirmation, How a Sacrament of God's Grace Became All About Us, and One in Christ, Virgil Michael Louis Marie Chauveau and the Mystical Body of Christ. He came to us as part of the McTaggart Lecture Series on the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, and he spoke to us on the future of Catholic higher education from a Marianist perspective. We had a wonderful conversation talking about grad school, theology, teaching, Marianist charism, and the future of Catholic higher education. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to Beyond the Lecture.
Welcome, Dr. Gabrielli, to St. Mary's, and I appreciate you coming here. Why don't you say just real briefly your name and your title and where you're coming from?
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here. So I'm Tim Gabrielli, and I'm the Gudorf Chair in Catholic Intellectual Traditions at the University of Dayton, also Associate Professor in the Religious Studies Department.
Good, good. Tell me a little bit about how you ended up at the University of Dayton as a professor.
Well, it's a longer story, actually. I kind of fell in love with theology at the University of Scranton, where I did my undergraduate in Pennsylvania with the Jesuits. And
were you a religion major there?
Yeah, theology. So I started off as a business major. I believe it or not, I was terrified of going to college. I didn't know what to expect. Sometimes we were just talking to the other moment there about pressures that students today face about getting jobs and things like that. I felt some of those pressures about I didn't know what I wanted to do, and it wasn't so much like I have to go and make a lot of money. I just didn't really feel like I had a great orientation to where I went, and so I was very nervous about it. But my dad was a CPA, an accountant, and not that he made that work look all that attractive, I'll say, but he's, why are you major in business? And I thought, I don't know. Okay, so I started a business major, and I was doing just fine in accounting and economics and all that sort of thing. But I also found that I was the person in the economics class who was saying, like, well, why is our fundamental assumption that all people act in their self-interest? Like, why is that our starting point? And so there would be these heads that would turn, like, what kind of, let's get back to cost curves, right? So
this doesn't answer problem 6.
Right. And so I really, when I was taking the kind of core curriculum, and I remember taking an intro to fiction course, which I just loved. And the first theology course, which I also loved. And what was interesting for me, I think, and I reflect on this often as I talk to students, that like this wasn't what came easiest to me. Math came easier to me, I think. Writing was hard. Writing still is hard. I think it's worth doing. It's a great thing. I like having written, but writing is a real challenge. So it wasn't something that I thought, well, this is something I'm really great at. But I loved it. I was drawn into the work of analyzing fiction. I was drawn into the bigger questions in the theology classroom that were opening up interesting insights about my faith that I hadn't thought about in certain ways before. And so that was really exciting to me. So I became a theology and English major, had a business minor for a little while, and then traded out for a philosophy minor and went full bore, humanities. But so then I was thinking about, well, how can I keep doing this kind of thing? And theology in particular was really exciting. And so I was applying to graduate schools in theology, and one of my professors said, have you thought about Dayton? And I said, where? I had applied to Notre Dame. I was thinking of Marquette and a couple of other places that were known for theology programs. But one thing, I was ready actually to go to the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium to study.
Oh, wow.
I had a friend who was going to go there and do philosophy, and we were going to live together, and he was going to do philosophy and I was going to do theology. And then kind of late, Dayton came to me with an offer of an assistantship, and I said, well, I can't really turn that down. And so I went to do a master's there, not knowing a ton about the place. and
So
really
Ohio
fell in
over
love.
Belgium, though.
Yeah. my girlfriend at the time, who is now my spouse, was very happy about that. It was long distance, but not as long distance, right? So, but yeah, right. I mean, that was tuition was incredibly cheap. I think it still is at Leuven, the Catholic University, but still sort of state sponsored.
Yeah.
So the tuition was manageable, but they don't have scholarships, so there was going to be some accrual debt, and working would have been difficult. So I think financially it made sense, and for other reasons, I think it was good to be a little closer to home. But as I got there, I really kind of fell in love with the way that they the folks there in the department thought about theology as always contextual. As thinking about, when we do theological work, we're thinking in the context of where we are in our place, and we're never thinking merely in the abstract. And that was a new way for me to encounter theological thinking. And so when it came time to think about PhD, and for me that was, could I have an opportunity to keep doing this? Is there a way I can milk this a little further and
keep going?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I ended up staying there to do a PhD. So I had spent, that was 2004 to 2012. I was in Dayton. In the meanwhile, I got married and dragged my loving spouse from the East Coast out to the Midwest, and so she indulged me in that, and then we had two kids while we were there, and when the kids were born, I kind of slowed down a little bit, and so we had been there for a while, and Dayton became like this second home, and then I was really quite privileged to get an offer to start as an assistant professor at Seton Hill University near Pittsburgh in Western Pennsylvania, and what a great place that was. I love the work there. A smaller place, about 1,800 students, real kind of great community there, fostered by the Sisters of Charity who sponsor the institution, and it was wonderful. And it also stretched me a good bit. I think sometimes when we're in graduate school, we think about the kind of focus that we have, and then and my focus is in sort of sacramental theology in the 20th century U.S. And so I remember getting to Seton Hill, and one of my colleagues saying to me, we're looking at the spring schedule in my first fall semester, and she said, well, in the spring, how about Intro to New Testament? That's kind of up your alley. And I thought, up my alley. I like it. I've read it. It's not really my training, but it stretched me in all these ways to teach an Intro to New Testament course, teach an Intro to Hebrew Scriptures course, to teach an early church history course, right? These are the kinds of things that you do at small places. Yeah. But I think really was, I hope it was okay for the students, but it was really good for me, for me to kind of like get a. So I worked there for 6 years, and I loved it. And
I'm just thinking about classes, because I was like the moral theologian at St. Vincent's,
yes,
which is about 6 miles away where we met. And it was, I'd done Lonergan, feelings, decision making, grace and freedom, and they're like, "Oh, can you do bioethics? Sure. How about Catholic social teaching? Sure. Marriage and family? Sure. Just environmental ethics? Sure. How about first theology, which is basically intro to the Bible? Sure. It is wonderful. Like it totally expands your sort of whole base and gives you a better sense of what's going on. But went small Catholic places, Catholic schools in general are like, hey, can you do this and this?
What
and
about
this,
that?
and
What
this,
about
and this?
I have to talk to our graduate students about that. That they, when they were learning to teach our intro course, one of the great privileges I have to. So I mean, the end of the story there, all the way back to your question, was that UD came calling again, and I for this position, which is really kind of unique in that it's an endowed chair position, but typically in the university, right, we associate endowed positions with lighter teaching load, heavy research, graduate students. And all those things are part of what I do. I'm privileged to have a kind of reduced teaching load, and I do work with graduate students, and I do research. But this position had a particular emphasis on the cultivating conversations and work around Catholic intellectual traditions with our undergraduates, which is a unique thing for an endowed position to be focused at undergraduate work. And I think that's something we share in kind of in our position. But so that's relatively unique. And I thought, if this were a position that were, go do research and work with graduate students, as attractive as that is, and as much as I love working with our graduate students and doing research, I probably wouldn't have been moved by it. But the fact that it was about working with undergraduates as well as graduate students and thinking about teaching about the Catholic intellectual tradition and how to foster those conversations was really, and then it was Dayton, and Dayton had become kind of like, as I say, a second home, and so that's really what led me back. But one of the pieces of that has been really a lot of fun is working with our doctoral students when they begin teaching for the first time. So in their second year of their grad assistantship, they, the first couple semesters, they work for a faculty member doing various, research help and teaching help. But then they're in the second year, they're the instructor of record in an intro course. And so working with those students starting in spring of their first year through the summer in preparation to teach, and we have a kind of common syllabus that we work with, and we kind of form this little, I call it a pedagogy group. We do some preparatory work and some thinking about teaching, and then we continue to meet, and then we do observations of one another. We meet weekly and talk about how might we approach this set of texts and materials, which is really just a blast and a privilege, I think. I really enjoy that work. But I was thinking earlier about your point about, coming to St. Vincent and can you do this? Can you do that? And then when you talk about, they say, we have this common syllabus and it's helpful because I don't have to think, through it all. But at the same time, like, I don't know all this stuff all that well, and I have to learn. And, there's a section, as on Islam, a unit on Judaism, and then in theology is kind of a religious studies and theology intro. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I don't know much about Islam, and I'm afraid if students ask me about that, that's not my background. And I said, wait, get used to it. Like, this is kind of how, and so this is actually good for you, because like, it'd be much easier if I taught in my area of research. And sure it is, but that's not always how it goes.
Yeah, and I found it helpful too, like when you're teaching these classes where lots of it aren't in your area of expertise. I mean, I also try to remind myself that I do know things. Right. So I can study, and I can remember things. So I do have that sort of piece of knowledge. But it's also this sense that it's okay to admit that you don't know things. And it's kind of a relief for the students. And it's also this possibility, like, hey, we can learn something. We can go back. We can sort of investigate those things. And I find when I get myself into trouble is pretending like I know stuff. As a parent, I sometimes run into that problem more often than I should. But like trying to check myself, like, it's okay. I can't expect myself to sort of know everything.
Yeah,
and that's so there's can be something freeing and good pedagogically, good for the students too.
And I think that to learn that lesson earlier in your teaching career, because we'll have these anxieties early on about, we talk about how in graduate school, right, everybody has a kind of imposter complex, right? The imposter syndrome of how could I stand in front of the classroom? And, so there's that early on, that kind of pressure and that need to feel like you're an authority, and that you're, so, but to learn that earlier, that this is kind of, it's part of the game, and we're all continuing to learn, and to say to students, this is a really interesting question, I'm not sure, I have to get back to you on that, and that you could go away and then come back next week and say, let's pick up on that point that Josie raised, and let's talk a little bit about that, because here's what I learned. And then you're modeling to students the ongoing, and
there's relationships and conversations, and that can continue over time. Yeah, there's a lot to that.
Yeah,
I found fun. Yeah. So yeah, I just love teaching. I love to think about teaching. I actually used to watch documentaries from comedians. And just to see talking about how they're putting together their act. I'm not a comedian as much as I appreciate a good joke. But when they talked about like how you work with the audience, how you can try out jokes, how you can, like, some things that you think are going to be great totally flop, things that are offhand comments suddenly sort of take off, and how you also kind of work in development in response to this. And so it got me to thinking too very much about my sort of teaching, like how you're moving people along and you're trying to get them to not just know things, but think through things. And that trying to attend to how you might move them from A to B is is really sort of important. And it's also not just this kind of command, let's march you through those things. I one of my topics is Catholic social teachings, and there's all of those documents, and sometimes it's referred to as like the death march through the documents, because you're like, it's like 45 documents, and you're each of them 100 pages, and so like, how do you not do that, but how do you start to get them to think about ideas and principles through time, and then also their own sort of inquisitiveness that carries over past the classroom.
There was a faculty member who was still in the English faculty at UD, and I remember I was a grad student in this presentation in which he would say that, and I think he got some pushback from folks about this, though I think it makes a lot of sense, that all teaching is acting, which kind of fits with this, you know, that why? Well, not that it's insincere, right, but that you know, in acting, you're reflecting on, okay, what are my objectives in this scene? So I have objectives, things that I want to accomplish, and then the question is, you got to kind of script that you're working, but then you're kind of responding in the moment, right? And we talk about sort of generous actors who give a lot that you can respond to, right? And more stingy, and that you are playing a certain role. You know, I talk to graduate students about, you know, kind of what you're thinking about. What is your teaching persona? Yeah, which is not. It has to be authentic. It has to be you.
Can't put on a something
no, it doesn't work.
No,
but there is a way in which certain aspects of your personality are going to be accentuated, right? I mean, because none of us are the same person in every environment that we're in, right? Our family, among friends, and professional settings, and likewise in the classroom, that we're reflecting on what are those aspects of myself that are really going to kind of animate the classroom, and that's kind of like your point, I think, because you know, I think of the work of comedians is so often, I mean, there's so many different versions of comedy, but there's this kind of thread of, you know, drawing upon, at least maybe it's the comedy that draws me in particularly, but so much of it is in various ways, right? Drawing upon my own experience of the world, and then articulating that in a certain way, right? That holds it up, and
that other people can also see themselves and their experiences.
Yes. So from the particular to the universal, right? What is the particular, and then that becomes universal, and so like that, you know, bit of this. So you've got your script and you have your objectives, and then how are you going to achieve them in this particular scene? Tony Gadziba, who I think you know, who taught for many years at Villanova, he was at Dayton last year talking with some of our students, and he had said, you know, when he used that analogy of you know, being a stand-up comedian. It's like an act, you know. You want to loosen people up a little bit, and then you want to take them somewhere, right? And so there's so I think those kind of analogies get what's helpful about them, thinking, you know, to these other spheres of even performance. But they get us out of that mode of, you know, this is merely a set of concepts or texts or something that I've mastered, and now here I have to lay out that mastery, and then see, you know, and then measure how students absorb that or not, right? That model just, it's not completely bankrupt, but it's got some real problems, and so these other performance analogies get us out of that.
I always think of it as there's that the instrumental temptation where it's part of the model is like, I'm just going to download information. What information do I need to get the test, to get the test, to get the grade, to get the grade, to get the degree, to get the degree, to get the job, and there's some, you know, truth to that metaphor, but you lose something in it, and then you're trying to think about those relationships and the kind of environment that you're creating. And that's what I was thinking about. Not only acting, it's the setting and the context and the people that are sort of involved there. So that I found that helpful to think about that, not as it's just my performance per se, but what are we doing here to create this sort of reality? And as you're pretending to do that, right, you're also shaping your own perspective, your own habits. And so there's this formation piece here that as well. Like there's something, I think, trying to get that metaphor right for how teaching and learning happens in the classroom is really sort of essential. And so much of it is viewed as technical or viewed as instrumental, and it's hard hard to get past that. The other metaphor I sometimes use is coaching, because you're not on the field, but you're meant to be sort of mentoring them. And I coached middle school soccer, which is about right for me. But it was trying to like develop skills and develop habit, get them to sort of think, get them to sort of play, and then get them to make decisions on the field when you're not out there, sort of to do that. And that was always helpful for me, is that my job is not to think for the students, but to find ways to get them to think and make decisions on their own. And when that functions well, that it's amazing. I mean, so many students are bright and they have good ideas when they can find ways, opportunities to sort of express them. Sports has other problems when you get too extreme and too sort of competitive and too kind of crazy, or when the end becomes something else other than the sort of enjoyment of the sport that's there. But those are that trying to sort of adjust those pieces. So
the coaching metaphor of helping to put students in position to succeed, right, is one of the things that James Lang, who I don't know if you know,
for the
Assumption,
small teaching. I think
So he's great. He's joined us every summer. This group on Zoom has kind of come and we read his book. One of the first books he wrote was a kind of like introduction to college teaching, and it's a little dated, especially the technology section. But it's one of the few books I know that's written for the your first approach to the college classroom, right? One of the things that he talks about is the importance also as a teacher of, and I was thinking earlier about the point about, hey, you could say to students, I don't really know, I got that's a research question for me, but even beyond the kind of academic setting of continuing to be a student in various ways. So learning new things. He talks about picking up the piano at a certain point in life, and what does it feel like to be a beginner again, right? And how that puts you back and helps you to remember. I like to play golf on occasion. I do far less of it than when I was younger. But a couple of years ago, I was, I only maybe 4 or 5 times a year I go out, but I really enjoy it. And then a couple of years ago, I went out for those couple of times and just felt like, my swing wasn't there. And so for my birthday, my spouse Jessica got me a golf lesson, and it had been a while since I had taken. And I get out there on the driving range with the golf instructor, and the way that he kind of said, okay, well, let's look at what you're doing. Okay, well, let's go inside and we record your swing. Let's look at it, and let's look at it together. And what do you see there? And okay, now here let's look at Rory McIlroy, a professional golfer. Let's look at his swing and put that in. And all the time, it was great. I mean, it was incredibly helpful to me. But all the time, I'm sitting there thinking about like teaching, right? Like, well, so we're evaluating where we are, what our thoughts are, kind of taking an inventory of what we're doing, and then we're looking at experts and we're sort of thinking about how they do it and what can we learn from them. And now we're going to go let's go back out to the range and put it into practice. I was like, oh, this is really like,
exactly.
That's good.
Yeah. It's teaching. I'm going to switch now to your sort of research, because you did sacramental theology, U.S. American stuff. How did you, not just how you got into that, but why do you think those subjects are still important?
So I think,
as an ethicist, I'm thinking, of course, mine is the most important. So your argument.
So I think, so let me start about the kind of like what led me there, and then we can reflect, we can argue about it. When I was an undergraduate, was doing there was this kind of gap in the Diocese of Scranton for folks who had gone through confirmation, but there wasn't really anything for them in many parishes. The diocese was trying to respond. And so we had a small group that would gather on, like weekends to get together to do something, kind of faith formation. And I kind of got involved with them doing that work. And it led me to kind of think about, well, what is confirmation about? Like, what are we doing there? So that was a question that I brought to grad school with me, and then really kind of learned, I think, the tools at Dayton for an angle into that question, which is, thinking about it historically and its development. And what was interesting to me, to this book that I wrote on confirmation, was it is about confirmation, but it's really about the kind of role that confirmation has played as its theology and practice shifts and changes to kind of reflect the relationship to some extent between the Catholic Church in the U.S. and the wider cultural context, right? So it was kind of like a palimpsest, like you can read, like you see these kind of layers,
Like
right? layer, uncovering.
Yeah.
And so that was really that's really where that first project developed. And then this book that I wrote on mystical body theology, I just kind of like was looking around, reading, seeing mystical body stuff, or people talking about the mystical body of Christ all over the place, especially in the early 20th century. Like everybody's talking about this, and then it kind of goes away. And I kind of want to figure out, well, so what was going on with that, and why did it go away? So really, my work is this kind of historical theological work with a particular kind of interest in the way that sacramental theology is kind of in the mix. But I think so. It's one of those things that I don't feel like I always feel like a little bit of an interloper when I go to conferences with liturgists. I'm like, well, I'm not a liturgist, but there's this kind of connection there. Or I go to the conference with the historians, and I'm not quite a historian, but
I was laughing because my dissertation proposed title was "The Role of Feelings in Moral Decision Making According to Bernard Lonergan," and my committee said, "Strike moral." And I said, "Well, why?" I said, "Well, if it's an ethics job, then it's moral decision making. If it's a systematics job, it's about grace and freedom." It's about Lonergan. So strike that. So you can be, it's like, so depending on the job.
Stay nimble, man.
Don't close their doors.
Yeah. So
it does give you this kind of breadth and flexibility, especially for a small.
Yeah. No, that's right. I think, but as I continue to kind of think about, and I've been working, on this question about, I think really, there's this kind of thread in my work that's interested in the ways in which our kind of imagination of ourselves, especially in kind of constructing the individual, or thinking of ourselves primarily as individuals, and how that is in this tension with the deeper and longer Catholic tradition, right? Mm-hmm. So the effects of sort of individualism and on faith, on religious practice, and those kinds of things. This is kind of through line that runs through my work. That mystical body theology is this, well, among other things, a fundamental way of seeing the world, in which we are all caught up with one another, and it's a theological way of articulating that, other than say a sociological way. And so I think that, one of the things that fascinates me about sacramental theology, it's funny, I'm thinking about my mentor at Dayton, who was my dissertation advisor, Bill Portier, said initially, he said, why would you want to think about sacraments? I try not to think too hard about them. They just work. They work, and I don't want to think any more about them. And I was like, well, okay, so I mean, there's this kind of that it's like you try to dig too hard into theology of prayer or theology of sacraments, and it gets really difficult to say anything. So
it's like I mean, it's not quite the same, but it's like trying to dig down deep. Why do I love my spouse? I do deeply. There's lots of reasons, but I don't want to spend lots of hours analyzing that. I'm I'm not sure where that's going to end up.
I
just want to enjoy it.
And can we give an account? So what does an account look like of prayer working or sacraments? And so I think that's of course the wrong theological approach, right? But what's really interesting to me is, of course, the intersection of sort of sacramental practice and cultural context. So one of the things that I think I started to say before, that I've been working on this project on thinking about the relationship between faith and doubt. And why is it, my question is sort of why is it that we generally think of these terms as opposites? And I'm, running into encountering students who will say things like, well, I have these questions, and so clearly I don't belong in this religious tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I think that none of us belong, right? You know,
We are.
and so all kinds of
Yeah.
sort of questions, that the life of faith is this ongoing, it's ongoing unfolding thing that involves and makes room for those kinds of questions, struggles.
It is. I'm just thinking too, just about just friendships, relationships, being a parent, being a spouse. Like all of those things are kind of in many ways acts of faith, but they always have sort of questions. Like, what am I? Parenting, like I never know what I'm doing. I'm always asking questions. When I get something figured out, they're older now. I don't know what I'm sort of doing. And then,
Once again,
and marriage changes over time.
that's right.
And even like friends, I've had wonderful sort of friends that I've kept over my whole life. But you know, you're like, how did I end up here? Like, what are we doing? Like, how is this? This is just an odd. Like, one of my really good friends just sent us pictures of his trip to Disney World, like with his kids, which is this funny kind of state thinking about when we were friends back in grad school days. And so you're always, even in the midst of these very serious, long-term, loving relationships, relationships in many ways that are driven by faith because you trust these people. There's still questions of like, what are we doing, or how has this changed? Now we're living apart. Those things do not seem like opposites.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's totally, and the relationship analogy for faith is so. I mean, is so helpful, I think. And so, but I think so. Like one of my questions here is, what is it? So twofold. One, how have we, like, where is it that this question actually meets our cultural context? How have we responded to this question about the role of doubt? And there have been a variety of responses. Some have said, well, like that's a real problem. You don't have faith, right? We don't. But then how have we responded catechetically to this at various ages? Because one of the things is, like, when we think about those things coming up, there's a delicacy catechetically through that. Like, you don't want to sort of introduce this at an age in which it would be inappropriate, right? But you don't want to not introduce it and make it sound like the life of faith really is just a whole bunch of people who always have it figured out, and who are, you know, and I think there are cultural pressures actually pushing us in that other direction. And so trying to understand that. So how have Catholics in the U.S. approached that question in religious education catechesis? The other piece of it actually is, okay, what if we look at this question, like what if we look at faith from the angle of a kind of sacramental liturgical angle? Louis-Maurice Chauvet, the French sacramental theologian, has this great line where he says, you know, when all else is falling away, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but when all else is falling away and the thought enters the believer's mind that maybe, in fact, a God doesn't even exist, what else is there to do but to take in your hands, to do what the church does, to take in your hands a little bread and to take a cup, a little wine, and proceed on. So the kind of I think one of the things of thinking from the perspective of a liturgical or sacramental perspective, if we look at it from that viewpoint as opposed to an epistemological viewpoint, right, about knowledge, but if we look at it from that viewpoint, then the body, both the ecclesial body, the assembly and the larger sort of mystical body, and the physical body, right, are the custodians of faith, right, rather than the mechanisms of belief in the
Just
individual only, right?
The knowledge piece.
Yes,
like I've checked this box,
right.
and therefore
Knowledge,
I've got,
right, or even emotions, or even the kind of like individual spirit which is there, but not the sole custodian of faith, right? That this is kind of you know, so those classical categories of the fides qua creditor and the fides quae creditor, the faith of the believer and the faith of the church or of the believers collectively. Even more like, so the fides quae is kind of often identified with like the creed, for example, right? But this is kind of a fides quae, right? A faith of the believers, the body, that is beyond simply a set like doctrines, right? This is the kind of the way in which the church can sustain one's faith when one's own lights or one's own spirit even or one's own emotions don't feel like they're there. But then also the physical body, right? Like that the physical body actually putting yourself in a place, taking on certain postures, that is faith. And we have this very negative association with like going through the motions. That's a very negative thing. Well, what if actually the going through the motions actually sustains faith? And so I think it opens up that set of questions for us, that is not merely from the epistemological side, the kind of like, what can we know, how can we know? Those are important questions too. But what if we look at this kind of side of it?
Well, to me, two things. One, the doctrines, when they become decoupled from those sort of experiences, they become kind of something else. Like they're more, not just sterile, but like disconnected from the truth that they're supposed to be pointing towards. And so you can kind of assent to those doctrinal pieces, but that's not able to kind of sustain you if you don't have these other kind of relationships, if you don't kind of understand where those doctrines really sort of come from. And it's this, oftentimes I'm thinking of a metaphor for sort of school. Sometimes we oftentimes focus on the grades as if that's the outcome of sort of education rather than the sort of actual learning. And the grades are a measure and a proxy and can provide feedback and can be a tool to further the ends of education. But we get fixated on the grades sometimes, even if they're speaking truthfully. And the doctors, I always worry about that sometimes, that they become the checklist, the measure, the mechanism, but kind of pulling us away from the primary relationship of love of God and love of neighbor. They're supposed to speak to it truthfully about those pieces, but if you kind of miss those elements if you miss that connection to the body, you've kind of lost something. My second point is that I think the issue, which is for me always the problem, is that at the end of the day, I just think you're now an ethicist. You're thinking about formation issues, how the culture does this, how the church and literature does this. I tend to like everybody because I think they're all really deep down doing nothing that works about how do you live the faith.
It's like you've modified Ronner's Anonymous Christianity to anonymous ethicists.
Everybody's anonymous ethicist. Yeah, that's why I think it's the best of all the sub-disciplines. So it's probably why when we have conversations, those issues sort of overlap because I have those same issues about formation, church, and liturgy.
I mean, and one of the things about mystical body theology, I think, that I try to outline in that book, is that it really is this kind of theology that pulls together sacraments and ethics, or worship and morality. It does that for a number of folks, I think, because there's a tendency to sort of separate those pieces, that, you have the kind of like churchy stuff and the, prayer stuff and then you have how you act in the world, and you've got like, that's like, those are separate spheres. That seems to me a real problem. And so for a number of folks in the early 20th century, people like Virgil Michael and Dorothy Day and other folks involved in the liturgical movement, Catherine DeHuick Doherty, Paul Hanley Furphy, these folks in the U.S. Catholicism who are working at this intersection of, who are working on like real kind of societal structural issues of their day, but also deeply attentive to, I mean, in various kind of ways, but attentive to and practitioners of the liturgy, and that really kind of fuels them, and that they talk about those things, and they move together for them. And mystical body theology does some of that work.
And I've been thinking about this I've been thinking about Catholic higher ed for a while and Catholic identity for a while. And this is one of the things that I keep coming back to, is that lots of Catholic institutions will do the rituals well, opening masses, baccalaureate masses, celebration of holy days, blessings, and all of which is absolutely sort of important. But then they don't kind of get the internal operations of the institutions aligning with that somehow that these two things, your liturgical practices, become divorced from how you're running the show, and trying to make sure that those two things align well, not just the liturgies, but also like the social actions that are there. And it's hard, right? Because you're also got lots of other economic forces and sociological forces that are sort of shaping you, but trying to do that. And it's becoming more so now. It's like sort of director of a Center for Catholic Studies, trying to not just do things, but also make sure how it operates and functions is aligned with those pieces. But I think it gets me to my last question, which is, what's your thoughts on the future of Catholic higher education? And my just general theory, things are changing. Like higher ed's changing, financial models, demographics, the value that's placed upon sort of higher education, its role in an information economy. Catholic higher ed, as a subset of that too, has its own issues. The way in which Catholicism is perceived in culture, from that piece all the way down to how do you hand over mission to people that are not formed in it, and even if they want to be, how do you find the time to sort of form them, as well as the religious orders step back from those roles. So tell me the future.
That's an easy one.
I'll come back in a few years and check on it.
There's so many moving parts.
I know.
And
I'm
so many
trying to like
challenges,
discern there's a path, and so I keep asking people to see what they see.
So I think you're right. I think we're in a kind of moment of change. Pope Francis says that more broadly, we're not in an era of change, but in a change of era.
That's a great line.
And that that it's not just, one of the things I think about that is that, what he's trying to say there is that if we're in an era of change, it's this kind of response when people say like, everything's just moving around me. I don't know how to, everything's changing all the time, right? That those of us as we get older are kind of given to saying like, oh, things are
Get off
changing.
my lawn.
Yeah. Well, I was doing some work on Marshall McLuhan last year, and Marshall McLuhan says like, well, I write about all this media stuff, but it's not because I think it's just great. I actually want to do a kind of psychological job on it, but everything is just changing all the time, and I just think everything should slow down a little bit. And so you can understand that.
I said this to someone. I said, things are changing, and someone said, well, you're 50, and I just do that.
Yes. So there's that. So that when he says, we're not in an era of change, I think that's what he has in mind. That kind of like, well, everything's just in flux. And when everything's just in flux, right, then you're looking for some ballast. You're looking for something solid to grab onto, and then that becomes, that leads to a kind of nostalgia or re-entrenchment, or right, and that
go
could
back
be
to when it wasn't moving fast.
When it wasn't right. So then there was a time when things were stable,
which is usually made up.
But always made up. Always. So that I think is what when he says we're not in an era of change. I think that's what he's after. But in a change of era. So there is, and that there is, we're at a kind of transitional point from a number of perspectives, right? That requires then of us to actually think seriously about what are the resources from our tradition that can speak to this moment, rather than what can I grab onto for ballast, but rather what's there that actually might help us live into this new moment, right? And so that I think is the question we have to ask ourselves. So I'm just spending time here talking.
Now we got the question.
So now we've laid out the question. No, so I think actually,
as theologians, we're often, and I think academics are like, we're very good at diagnosing things. Treatment.
This is a lot harder. With somebody else. We'll leave that up to the people on the ground, right? Yeah. So, well, I mean, I think that so a couple of things. One, I think that there are real financial challenges in our moment that are going to continue to be with us, and I think that we are already seeing. We're in a moment of kind of like there have been moments in the church in the U.S. of expansion of institutions, and I think we're in. It varies by place. Things look different here in San Antonio than they do like in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. Mm-hmm. Archdiocese of Cincinnati is in this moment we're going from like 200 parishes to like 60. Right. Yeah. And San Antonio looks rather different. So in pockets, it looks different, and that's also looking different for Catholic colleges and universities, depending on where you are. But I think overall, we're in a moment of kind of in the big picture in the U.S., contraction of institutions. And that does not have to be, I mean, there's some, I think, grief and mourning that goes along with that, but that actually, those institutions are really instrumental to what we're about, right? And I think that's also true. So I think understanding that, and that's it's hard. It's hard when things like that change, but it shouldn't defeat our overall mission, which I think we try to encapsulate by this phrase, the Catholic intellectual tradition, what Catholic colleges and universities are about. So what are the resources we have there for thinking about who we are? And that, I think, is really important. Who are we and what are we doing? And so I think if we're going to move forward as Catholic colleges and universities, it's going to be only through who we are. And I think there's a temptation to think like, well, if we just kind of leaned into this aspect of, technical education or serving the economy, which has always been an important part of what Catholic colleges and universities do, right? Like helping people gainful employment,
getting jobs and job training.
It's always been there. That actually is part of who we've been, but it's not been the whole of who we have been and who we are. It's also been this other piece about, for folks who don't have the opportunity or hadn't had the opportunity, in Catholic higher ed in the U.S. anyway, folks who hadn't had the opportunity to engage with the larger intellectual tradition around, in philosophy and theology and history and English, in the sciences and all of those things, haven't had the opportunity to engage with those fields and reflect upon what is our life about, right? What makes the common good? What are the kinds of things that are part of being a good person, of living a holistic life, of faith development, right? That's always been part of what we do at Catholic colleges and universities. And so I think that the first thing is that we have to understand who we are, and that we're only going to be able to continue to be in any way relevant to society if we continue to think about that and do that work. And I actually think that, we were talking about this before. I actually think that that piece of an education, amidst religious disaffiliation, amidst other upheavals going on in society, actually is very relevant to young people. I mean, the conversations I have with students, these are questions. There are pressures, and there are plenty of pressures on students, I think. And there are, questions about, do I even need a college degree anymore to enter the workforce? But all those pressures are there. But like, how am I going to live a fulfilling and complete life? What does it mean for me to kind of be a person in this society? And how do I think about the complex issues of today? And that my job is important, but it's not the whole of my life, God willing. And so that those things, actually, I find students are really, really interested in. But we have to resist the ways in which those things can be subjected to really just other ways to grind us down. So like, sometimes our talk about vocation can get like sucked into this other. So like, when we talk about like this description of vocation as like finding your passion and then we find your passion and then you work hard, but if it's your passion, you're never really going to work a day in your life, right? Well, that's false, right? I have like my dream job, and there's still parts of it that are drudgery and toil. That's kind of part of human life. Work is going to be work.
It's the same thing. Like if I think about any other job, I'm like, that would be 100 times worse than my job. But it's also,
it's still work. And recently the Great Resignation, right after COVID, a number of people left their jobs, and then folks got new jobs, and then realized that it was still work. maybe it's actually not the job. Maybe it's sort of like my orientation to the world.
You can create some distance, it's a great job and I love this, and even my calling, but it's also not the completeness of who I am.
Yes,
and that always seems and I like the language of vocation, but like it has that sense of like, oh, it becomes your whole sort of identity. Stanley Hauerwas, John Paul II came out with the document on the, what was it? On the Laborum Exercens.
Oh, yeah.
Stanley Hauerwas's commentary was like, this is the worst encyclical ever written. It'll probably destroy encyclicals for all the whole future. But his point was...
Typical hyperbole from Hauerwas.
Hilarious. But his point was like, if he was worried that you're baptizing your job in the economy as your Christian vocation, and that has that sort of sense of taking over.
Yeah. Leaning into, and JP2 leaning into the co-creation side, right, of work, and maybe leaving behind the toil side from one piece of the Genesis 2-3.
Yeah, and so I like this model, and I know you've sort of laid it out before, but it also avoids these kind of two extremes, I think, in Catholic higher ed, which is to like have no mission or identity, become like everybody else, or the other one where the mission is so sort of rigid and over-determined everything that you don't have any room for this, any room for sort of life in the midst of those things. And I think that's when you hit that sort of virtuous middle, and I feel like I'm criticizing people too much, and I don't really mean that, but like, because I can understand those sort of trends there. But when you hit that virtuous middle, it really is about sort of what are the things that you have to offer. And the Marianist places are going to offer something different than Jesuit places, than diocesan places, than Benedictine places. And that they're all gifts, even though they're all speaking to this sort of, not just the job, but also the life beyond the job. And if you can hit that well, I think that's the kind of offering that the Catholic institutions have to give their contribution, and not just how to survive, but why you should survive.
Yeah. Which is exactly what we want our students to think about, right?
Yeah.
Not just how to work, not just a technique.
Yeah.
But why you should do anything. Yeah. Right. So we turn that back on ourselves. I think, after the Second Vatican Council, right, there was this call to religious orders to rediscover, rethink, perform a kind of resource mall, right? A return to the sources of their charism and do that kind of work. I think we're in another moment like that now, and we should think of it like that in higher education, tied to these charisms. Many Catholic colleges and universities come out of the charisms of religious orders, right? I think it's a time now for us to be thinking, okay, let's do a resource mall. Let's go back to the sources of that charism, of that order, and see what's there for our moment, and to do that work. Because sometimes I find that we don't want to carve out time for that work because we feel it's a time of pressure and we need to, and folks calling for those sorts of things or trying to like delay or just don't. But then if you don't pause to do that kind of work, then you're not actually, it's very easy to lose track of the mission or to make it into, to make it more of a mirror, right? Like you're seeing what you want to see there, and we put the Marianist stamp on it, and
you're doing what everybody else is doing.
Yes, but we just
and
we just find our way to kind of like, well, we just have to put our own language on it, put our own veneer on what else. But that doesn't that's how it just floats right out of our fingers. But and so change of era, right? And that then leads us to but also, I mean, one of the other among the many challenges, and these conversations are going on all over the place at Catholic institutions, is the fewer and fewer members of vowed religious, right? This is another reason why we need to go back to those sources and think about what they have to offer us in our moment, I think, and we shouldn't be afraid of that work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's such a joy.
Yeah.